My thesis is an ode to the 17 clients of color I worked with during the practicum training of my master's program. Based on a clinical reflection of my academic and clinical experience in counseling psychology, I have observed that the theory and praxis of psychology in the US is white-centered, which harms people of color who already suffer from systemic and structural white supremacy. Before presenting on whiteness or about color and race, it is important to acknowledge my own color and positionality in all of this. I must begin by forfeiting any attempt to define my social location in a manner that is definitive or stationary. What I mean is that I feel like a walking contradiction. In racial identity alone, I'm completely tangled up. I am a Japanese American whose ancestors did not go through internment. My ancestors in Japan were killed or traumatized from the bombings by the US during World War II, yet I identify more as American than I do Japanese. While belonging to the same census group as other Asians and Asian Americans in the US, I'm hesitant to feel part of the group when Japanese imperialism caused the genocide of many Asian countries. I feel guilt for being a dual citizen of Japan and the US and immigrating to this country safely by choice, while other immigrants in this country do not have citizenship anywhere and risk their lives to be here. I feel cornered in my participation in the US, inflicting harm onto other countries through the food I eat, the clothes I wear, the car I drive, among other countless harmful actions I take on a daily basis. The juxtapositions of my social locations seem dually me, yet not me at the same time. I feel tangled up because I'm perceived and perceive myself as a sum of ideological contradictions. I walk the world holding within my psyche, body and spirit, the contradictions I have identified and have yet to identify. If I don't look up and pay attention, white supremacy will make me subscribe to things like the model minority myth, which makes me feel too privileged in comparison to other people of color, so that in my guilt and shame I do not speak up. White supremacy is insidious in that by creating specific racial oppressions, it pits people of color against each other, so that it becomes hard to see that the oppression is caused by the same hands, which just so happen to have a hand in all of the systems and structures of our society. What I most want to convey regarding my social location and positionality in the context of my work as a therapist is encapsulated in Malcom X's words, "The only way we'll get freedom for ourselves is to identify ourselves with every oppressed people in the world." Freud, the founding father of psychology, whose theories academia deems as foundational and compulsory for future clinicians, focuses on the analysis of the patient's intrapsychic or individual world, irrespective of and in a vacuum from their race, cultural context, and engagement with social others. The negation of culture is not an oversight. Freud criticizes culture as primitive. In Future of an Illusion, Freud states that the great mass of uneducated and oppressed must be held down most severely and kept most carefully away from any chance of intellectual awakening, due to their inability to keep from killing each other without the fear-based delusion of culture. He set a precedence in the field that does not question the morality of compulsions and delusions that keep exploitative and irrational social systems in existence, but instead sits back to observe the futility of social change. The competency movement or postmodern approach of recent years is an attempt to rectify the historical fact that the field of psychology omitted people of color in its inception. Terms such as diversity and cultural competency are added on to existing white-centered therapy frameworks, which relieves white academics and clinicians of guilt, while clinicians and clients of color are left with the labor of navigating the gap between ideas and reality. Generalized, stereotypical, and outright racist notions of racial behavior are summarized by race-based sections at the end of textbooks in the name of cultural competency, only to further strengthen the white gaze onto people of color in clinical and empirical terms. As I navigated the healthcare system with clients of color, I quickly realized how white supremacy impacts not only clinical interpretations and pathology, but systems and structures of mental health care. For marginalized communities, they are subjected to time-limited, narrowly goal-oriented, and cost-efficiency-focused psychotherapy and medication-based treatments. While this system is scant in the services it offers, it somehow operates to fund structures of white dominance, like insurance and pharmaceutical companies that profit greatly off of keeping people sick. Meanwhile, clients of color experience the most adverse health outcomes, including higher mortality and higher instances of substance abuse, mental, and physical health disorders. Some would argue that there are therapeutic modalities that, while founded by white clinicians, starkly contrast from Freudian theory or the US healthcare model and are helpful to people regardless of race. After all, how could Winnicott's concept of play, Rogerian unconditional positive regard, or Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based harm reduction possibly do harm? To this, I point to the gross error of not acknowledging race. Such a stance does not acknowledge the historical and ongoing context of white centering, dominance, and supremacy, which have caused the trauma of genocide, slavery, colonization, detainment, internment, racism, and exploitation onto people of color. A framework that does not acknowledge the social injustices people of color experience is violent and assumes the white experience as the standard of normalcy. The lack of acknowledgement of race and culture in white-centered therapy persists not only in bypassing past and present atrocities, but in not attributing credit to whom it is due. Long before Freud himself dabbled with meditation, and centuries before the clinical effectiveness of meditation was validated by the American Psychiatric Association, mindfulness, as packaged in the West, had long been integral to mental health and well-being across Asia. 1952 was the year the first edition of the DSM came out, but in 1500 BCE, the Ebers Papyrus, a 110-scroll medical manual, each 20 meters long, was already used in Egypt to treat mental illness for what we would diagnose today as schizophrenia and depression. Psychologies that do not originate in white dominance, such as these, what I term psychologies of color in my thesis, are in today's white-centric field of psychology referred to as alternative healing practices, and are regarded for some reason as postmodern and supplementary modalities. It is from a place of indignation towards white-centered psychologies that discredits the validity and efficacy of psychologies of color that have been practiced for ages, and a desire to learn from them myself to offer their wisdom to clients of color that I have begun studying psychologies of color and draw from them in my clinical work. In acknowledging my social location and positionality, it is not without hesitation that I do so. There is always a caution and sensitivity within me that I hope to never lose, of generalizing, reducing, and appropriating another culture in the process. I continue to explore nonetheless, by saying that if and when I do, I will reflect upon my ignorance, apologize to those I may have hurt or offended, and not repeat the same mistake. There are countless psychologies of color that I will no doubt spend my life trying to study, but for the sake of my thesis, I drew from a few that I have explored during my master's program, which are aspects of indigenous psychology, liberation psychology, Black psychology, and Buddhist psychology. Indigenous psychology. In exploring indigenous psychology, I acknowledge that indigenous healing practices are not homogeneous, and generalizations are problematic. It is impossible for me to cover the breadth and depth of all indigenous healing practices here, and I am not in the position to do so. But I will share one aspect delineated by indigenous clinicians and scholars as an example of a psychology that offers counter approaches to white dominance. Epistemological hybridity is a term to describe when clinicians enmesh themselves in the cultural life world of the patient and the community they come from. An example that was shared by Eduardo Duran is when engaging with Native patients, he holds their verb-based worldview in mind rather than a noun-based view common in English, thinking of who, what, where, when, why. While a noun-based worldview separates and objectifies things, a verb-based view focuses on the interconnectedness and movement between things. In the case of diagnosing mental illness, for example, a noun-based view would be harmful because in indigenous cultures, names are often bestowed onto individuals to grow into at different phases of life, and a diagnosis would be like an act of sorcery or casting a spell. A verb-based view would instead allow a person named to experience illness, not as a thing they have or are, but as a spirit that is visiting them, allowing room to develop a relationship with the illness on their path to healing. Liberation psychology acknowledges the psychological wounding caused by war, fascism, poverty, and violence, the long-standing history of the oppressed having been taught to silence and accommodation by the institutions around them. Liberation psychology validates historical memory, critical reflection, and aims to awaken agency, power, desire in order to imagine new ways of existing. Different from the way white-centered therapy views client resistance as disobedient to the clinician's prescribed treatment, liberation psychology says it can be dismissed and pathologized or acknowledged and utilized. Resistance from the perspective of liberation psychology is acknowledged as the client's values, principles, hopes, and fears, and an entry point for dialogical and collaborative therapy once therapist and client are on equal planes. Client resistance can be viewed as not just a response to power, but a form of power, a signifier of a client's conscious awakening to their own authority, which becomes words spoken back to the therapist and beyond the therapy room. Black psychology. While Black psychology may not have been coined as such until the writings of psychiatrist Frantz Fanon, W.E.B. Du Bois was already writing about the Black self-consciousness in the late 1890s. Du Bois gave speeches and published between 1890 and 1963, which overlaps with Freud publishing between 1891 and 1940. Du Bois developed a theory of listening to consciousness in an attempt to understand the trauma of racism and the long drawn-out historical repercussions of slavery. Importantly, however, Du Bois' meditation on trauma precedes Freud's. Du Bois' thinking also surpasses Freud's in beginning from the premise that trauma is the sine qua non of theorizing racism, which makes itself felt not only outwardly in social and economic structures, but inwardly in consciousness and memory. My experience with the field of psychology has been that it likes to come off as though race, culture, and social context are modern ideas that are now being added into white foundation, simply because it did not have the social exposure to consider such nuances way back when. Yet how can this be so when emerging ideas on consciousness, one including racial and social context and one not, were being published at the same time? Intersectionality is the opposite of excluding social groups that don't belong to the dominant narrative. This term, commonly used in academia today to address the belonging to of various group identities, should be attributed to Black feminism, as it was Kimberly Williams Crenshaw who developed the theory of intersectionality as a way of mediating the tension between assertions of multiple identity and the ongoing necessity of group politics. I will not say that such a concept was ahead of Freud's time, as he clearly articulated his stance on class, race, and gender in his theories. I will instead state here, in the form of 3 questions, my frustration during the past 2.5 years in academia, every time a professor told me to learn the foundation first, when I pushed back on traditional Freudian theory. Why are we calling his perspective the foundation of psychology when there are so many who came before him? What is making us cast aside the violence and trauma of racism to keep white-centered traditional theories alive? Why must we continue centering whiteness in the field of psychology when it harms people of color? Fanon elaborates upon the transformative power of Black psychology in its ability to emancipate Black people from the wretchedness they were forced into and unearth a dignified and free consciousness. Black psychology confronts the past and present to make way for healing and liberation while drawing upon inner power and imagination to create new realities and ways of being in the future. Buddhist psychology. I'm almost there. Historically, Orientalism, Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, Tibetan Buddhism, meditation, and mindfulness, along with its cousins, yoga, vegetarianism, and minimalism, have been lumped into one general ideology in white-centered societies. Textbooks unapologetically weave in and out of Zen and Tibetan Buddhist concepts without distinction when referring to Buddhist psychology, the generalization fossilized by adding the word psychology after Buddhist. Combining Tibetan and Zen Buddhism to represent the entirety of Buddhism and fusing it into the framework of white-centered psychology by calling it Buddhist psychology is biased, generalizing, and appropriative. For this reason, I take a step from what is generally known as Buddhist psychology in the West and focus on the definition of Buddhist psychology that I'm most familiar with, based on the Nichiren Buddhist community that I am a part of, which focuses on self-empowerment, community engagement, and social justice as practiced by the Soka Gakkai International People's Movement. Buddhism began 2,600 years ago. It has a long and rich history of addressing suffering, promoting individual enlightenment, psychological empowerment, and community empowerment against social justice. Buddhism has long known and used what psychological research is only recently beginning to validate as sound approaches to the development of psychological and community well-being. Buddhist psychology has the most to do with the way in which I sit with clients. Chanting is a somatic therapy option to help clients settle into their bodies, but I personally do not suggest the literal act of chanting to clients because of my personal and religious relationship to Buddhism. Because I personally chant at home, however, I am able to sit with clients in my most grounded state, which no doubt affects our interaction and the environment we co-create. Similar to my having an altar for chanting at home, I conceptualize the clinical setting with clients as a sacred space for clients to reflect on their present circumstances and inner realities, while centering on their inherent power and mirroring back the client's strengths, resilience, and agency. It's hard to conclude, while I will now, a presentation that ended up becoming a culminating overview of the past 2 years of my life. What I have learned about counseling psychology in academia, and even more, what I have gained from my engagement with clients I worked with, deeply impacted my person. As I wrap up my master's program, advocating for people of color by decentering whiteness and drawing from psychologies of color for healing, liberation, and empowerment is what I have come to feel most passionately about in this work. The 17 clients of color I've worked with have become to me walking universes whose stories, rich in cultural, historical, and social context, coupled with unique trials, tribulations, and joys, are impossible to convey. They have made me fall in love with the honorable work of being a therapist, which by my definition is to be a witness of and to journey with but a small fraction of another person's life in supporting their healing, liberation, and empowerment, despite oppression and suffering. And I'm not going to read that quote, I'll just leave it up there because I extended my period, but thank you so much for listening.